Prime Minister, welcome to the program and thank you for your time.
Thanks, Leigh. Good to be with you.
Is the combination of coronavirus and the bushfires going to drive Australia into a recession?
Well, I'm not getting ahead of these issues. What we have done on the coronavirus is focus very much on the health challenge, and that's what we always have to put first. And that health challenge is a very serious one. But at the same time, we know that this global health crisis around the coronavirus is going to have very significant and very real economic impacts, which we are already feeling here in Australia. It's being felt in many other countries, in most, I should say, all around the world. And so we'll see how that plays out, Leigh. What we need to do is ensure that with the fiscal response that we will provide, and which I flagged last week that we'd be delivering, that it is very targeted, that it's very measured and it's very scalable, so we can continue to respond to these issues as they emerge.
When will you be announcing the details of that package and where will it be targeted?
We'll be announcing those soon, Leigh, and we'll be announcing the key areas we'll be targeting on at that time.
And is soon before the May federal budget? Because one assumes there's a degree of urgency here.
Yes, it is.
On the health challenge that you mentioned, Australia's borders afford it some natural protection. Why isn't there a broader travel ban in place than China and Iran, particularly given the rapid spread in countries like South Korea and Italy?
Well, we've been following the medical advice, Leigh, right from the outset, and our medical advice has been outstanding. Dr. Brendan Murphy, the Chief Medical Officer, called this well out ahead of the rest of the world, particularly the WHO, and that happened again last week as we moved to put in place the emergency response plan to deal with a pandemic phase, and that was actioned last week. And now the health advice at this moment has not suggested going beyond the existing travel bans that we have. That said, today, particularly with the information we're seeing coming out of Korea and out of Italy, then we are looking again at those measures right now. But it is important to point out that in Iran, this is the place which has been the most severe set of conditions we've seen outside mainland China. And you're also dealing with a situation in Iran that does not have an advanced health system and different sort of issues pertaining to their economy and how their country operates. In places like Korea, though, and in places like Italy, we're dealing with something quite different. But there is no options off the table, I can assure you, Leigh, and we'll be always putting the health of Australians first.
The Reserve Bank has once again today cut interest rates to try to bolster the economy, as we've heard. The RBA and business leaders have been urging the government to come up with a detailed fiscal plan to help the economy out for quite a while. How is it possible that you don't have an economic centrepiece beyond a slogan for jobs and growth?
Well, I completely reject that, Leigh. Last year alone, we brought forward $4.2 billion worth of our program on infrastructure to address the very issues that you've just raised. Last year, we passed tax cuts for Australians, which were some of the most significant we've seen in decades. The government has been continuing to expand our trade borders through the arrangements we've put in place, which has meant that we would have been even more reliant on those countries that have been most affected by this crisis, where we're not acting in the way we were. So I completely just don't accept that allegation, Leigh.
Well, let me run through some of it with you. You mentioned your income tax cuts. Their effect on the economy has been muted when you look at the major indicators. You've done nothing on IR, nothing on superannuation, nothing on GST reform, nothing big on company tax reform, no target for emissions reduction beyond 2030. Business leaders feel there's no agenda.
Well, I don't agree with them, Leigh. And at the beginning of the term, when I came after the last election, I set out an agenda that dealt with infrastructure, that dealt with industrial relations, in fact, quite specifically.
Well, let me ask again, why do you think business leaders are always out there saying we need the government to be doing more?
Well, let me take the issue they often make on emissions reduction. I'm not going to put up people's taxes, Leigh. I'm not going to put on a carbon tax. And if it's business leaders asking me to do it, or the Labor Party asking me to do it, or indeed you asking me to do it, I'm not going to put on a tax to reduce emissions, nor am I going to put people's jobs at risk, nor am I going to see rural and regional parts of the economy which depend on industries. I'm not going to put them at risk. We have an emissions reduction target, Leigh, and it is for 2030, and we've been able to reduce emissions by 13.1% since 2005. Ahead of most like countries, whether that's New Zealand or Canada, and we have a target to hit our 26% by 2030, and we're on track to achieve that. And we've got a plan to achieve them, which is more important. Plenty of people can have targets, But we have a habit of hitting our targets, like we will in 2020 this year, where people said we wouldn't, and we're going to beat it by 411 million tonnes.
But you seem to suggest that doing more would be costing jobs and potentially economic growth. Take the example of the British Prime Minister Boris Johnson. His government and successive Conservative governments there have been on the front foot on climate change action. They have a net zero by 2050 policy. Since 1990, Britain's cut emissions by 42% and at the same time seen a 73% increase in economic growth.
Yeah, what I'd make the point about the UK economy is it's quite different to the Australian economy, Leigh, and you've got to have plans that relate to your own country. The UK also has nuclear power, Leigh, and they also have a big extension cord which plugs into the nuclear power in France. So you've got to deal with like for like countries. So what I'm telling you is that we're ahead of New Zealand and we're ahead of Canada, and particularly when you compare us to Canada, I think you're looking at more like for like economies. And we will have a plan for achieving these things. I mean, plenty of people can have targets, but if you don't have a plan to achieve them, then all that means is at the end of the day is you don't know what it's going to cost, and you're going to end up taxing people and threatening people's jobs without a plan. But
also a plan without a target is meaningless because you don't know where you're going. Can I ask you?
No, I don't agree with that, Leigh. No, Leigh, I don't agree with that. I mean,
you think you can have a plan without a goal, without an end point?
No, Leigh, what I'm saying is we're developing the technology plan. The Minister for Energy was making reference to that last night. Now, that technology plan will enable Australia to reduce its emissions without putting up electricity prices, without putting people's jobs at risk, and without saying to people who live in North Queensland or anywhere else, sorry, you're going to have to go and do something else.
But a technology plan has limitations. You could have made a technology plan, say, in 2001. It would have been obsolete by 2006 because technology changes.
Yeah, but that's the whole point about the technology plan is it's looking at future technologies. Take hydrogen,
How can you look at future technologies? They're not invented yet.
Well, Leigh, let's talk about hydrogen. We've got a plan in place with both the Japanese government, the Victorian government and the Australian government. It's worth $500 million, and that is to ensure we have a viable hydrogen energy system in Australia into the future, as other countries can. Finding those technologies and doing the ground research now to make sure they're available post-2030 is what we're doing. The reason we're getting more gas out of the ground through arrangements we're putting into place with state governments is to ensure that we've got those fuels which can provide transition, which give you the lead time for these other technologies to come in place. That's what our plan does. And if that plan results in receiving about 2050, if that were to result in a net zero carbon position by that period of time, well, fine. But it would only be because we had a plan that achieved that. Just announcing a target is quite meaningless unless you've got a plan.
But when all the states and territories in Australia have committed to a zero emissions target by 2050, when 73 major businesses, including Qantas, whose praises you were singing today, and BHP have agreed to that, when peak business groups are calling for it, when environmentalists and scientists are calling for it, why is the federal government determinedly isolated?
Leigh, I'm not going to commit to a target when I can't look Australians in the eye and tell them what it costs or how it's going to be achieved.
Have you done any of the modelling of the costs of not going to net zero by 2050?
This is why we do take action on climate change, Leigh. So the argument that it's about, what's the cost of not doing anything? Well, we are doing something. So I don't accept that argument.
But have you modelled it? Because, for example, sorry to interrupt, Prime Minister, but Melbourne University.
No, you can interrupt.
Melbourne University's had a look at it. They've found that the potential economic risk to Australia if global emissions patterns remain the same are 584 billion by 2020 and 762 billion by 2050.
Well, we're not planning to take no action, Leigh, so that
the
argument is moot.
If patterns remain the same.
Well, we're not planning to have patterns remain the same. We're planning to reduce emissions with a technology plan which will achieve that, but I'm going to do it in a way where I can look Australians in the eye and say, I'm not going to put a tax on you, I'm not going to take your job from you, and I'm not going to undermine industries that are very important to rural and regional Australians. I think they're fairly reasonable commitments and balanced commitments. See, I mean, it is about having a balanced plan to achieve all of these things. That's what I took to the last election. That's what I said to the Australian people. I took a 2030 plan, and the Labor Party today can't even tell you what it should be in 2030. We did that when we were opposition. And in 2010, when we were in opposition, we set out a plan to how we would meet the 2020 Kyoto targets. We have a Labor Party today that can't agree on themselves about anything and can't even tell you what should happen in 2030. So how can you believe about 2050?
You were talking earlier about the need to keep investment going, particularly at the moment. The Chief Executive of the Business Council of Australia, Jennifer Westacott, wants a net zero target by 2050 legislated because she said it would cause a massive advance in this country. It would drive investment. Isn't it time to give business that certainty they would like for investment in this area?
I don't agree with having a target that provides a reverse tax on the Australian economy. I mean, and whether it's the if it's the business community who says they want a tax, or if it's you or anyone else, I don't agree. I don't agree that we should be putting a tax on the Australian economy to meet a targeted emissions level.
Okay.
I don't agree.
Let's zip around some other matters in the news, Prime Minister. Your office exchanged 136 emails with Bridget McKenzie's office regarding the sports grant affair. Why?
Well, we made representations on the basis of projects that were brought to us and to pass on information about other funding programs which related to those projects. I've been pretty clear about that. The
Australian National Audit Office has told Senate estimates that Senator McKenzie wrote to your office on April the 10th, including the colour-coded spreadsheets of what she intended to fund, summarised by state, political party and electorate. The brief then went to Sports Australia on April the 11th. The National Audit's Office also told Senate estimates that projects were added and removed after correspondence with your office. Can you see why, to the average Australian, that looks like it was worked out for political gain?
Well, what I can tell you is that the projects that were authorised by the Minister, that brief was signed and dated on the 4th of April. And the Minister was the decision maker here, Leigh. The Prime Minister office was not. The Minister made decisions, and the National Audit Office found that all the representations that were made by my office were no more effective than anyone else's. So if anything, I was accused of not being a particularly good advocate.
Broadly, the Auditor-General found it was a politicised process. The Secretary of your department, Phil Gaetschen, says it was not transparent. He noted the disconnect between the Minister's decisions and Sports Australia's recommendations. And yet Australian taxpayers still haven't been given any explanation of the decision-making process that drove $100 million in spending of their taxes. You don't see a problem with that?
Well, this is what the government has done. The Australian National Audit Office did a report which went into the very issues you've talked about. It made 4 recommendations. We have adopted all of those recommendations.
But Prime Minister, my point is, Australians... I'm sorry. I want to go to the question here, which is that Australians do not understand there's been no transparency around that decision-making process.
Leigh, what one of those recommendations was related to ensuring that the transparency of that process should be there in the future, because what occurred on this occasion was that the Minister had complete discretion around these issues, not what might have otherwise happened under the many other programs. Of course you want grief. Haven't you wanted to get to the bottom of how she made those decisions? Well, this is what I'm trying to tell you, if you just let me finish the answer. They made recommendations that should change, and we have agreed with that. Secondly, I initiated the review that was done by the Secretary of the Department, who didn't find that bias to be in place, by the way. But
well, we wouldn't know that because we haven't seen a report.
Well, he released a statement, Leigh, which actually went into the same matters that were covered in that report, so he's been very transparent about that. But the other point is that he made recommendations about whether the statement of ministerial standards had been breached, and the Minister resigned when I shared those results with her. So an Auditor-General has reported on it. We've accepted all the recommendations of the report, and in relation to the report done by the Secretary of Prime Minister and Cabinet, the Minister has resigned. I would say the government has taken quite a bit of action on that.
Angus Taylor had to apologise for issuing false information from his office, which brought your government into disrepute. On this program last night, he was clear that he's not worried as to how that happened. He's not puzzled about the discrepancy between his account and the metadata from Sydney City Council. You had to deal with days of distraction because of it. Are you bothered to get to the bottom of how one of your senior ministers came to be distributing doctored material?
Look, Leigh, those matters were considered by 2 police investigations and dismissed. What I'm interested in, Leigh, and I think what Australians are interested in, is what's going on with the coronavirus, what's going on with bushfires, what's going with the economy, which are the matters that we discussed earlier in this interview.
But Prime Minister, the reason I'm asking, if I can pick you up on that point, the reason I'm asking about this is because when you want to talk about those big issues, people's trust in you and your credibility are your most important assets. I've outlined 2 examples there where your ministers have breached public trust, and in both cases you're saying to voters there's nothing to see here when there are still unanswered questions. Well, no, that's not what I said, Leigh, and you shouldn't paraphrase me in that way. What I said is the National Audit Office reviewed this matter, made recommendations, and we adopted all of them, and the Minister resigned. We still do not know in this matter how these decisions were made. They were made based on the discretion of the Minister, which was the way that program was lawfully established. And these matters, that's what that program was. It was a program of ministerial discretion. See, when ministers become ministers,
ministers, they go through elections, whether it's in the Senate or the House of Representatives. Politicians are elected to make decisions. She made decisions with that authority to do so. That's how that scheme was established lawfully. And the Auditor General has looked at that and made recommendations about how that should be done in the future, and I have agreed and the government has agreed with that. And in relation to particular matters about how the program was administered, the minister resigned. So I think it would be unfair for you, Leigh, to suggest that the government hasn't taken that issue, and indeed the minister hasn't taken it seriously, when indeed the minister ended up resigning.
You won't release the Gaetjens report into the sports rorts. Your office tried to conceal when you're on holidays in Hawaii in December. The government cited national security to avoid answering a question under FOI about whether Pastor Brian Houston was invited to a White House dinner, although you've finally admitted this afternoon that he was invited. Why all the secrecy on stuff that on the surface would seem to be not that big a deal?
Well, those things aren't that big a deal that you've talked about, Leigh. And
I'm always focused on then?
Leigh, I'm just focused on the things that I took to the Australian people.
No, and I just want to know why the secrecy. You're not answering what I'm asking.
Leigh, well, I've disclosed the issues you've referred to. So, I mean, in relation to one of those matters, I mean, I could have been more candid at the time about it. I wish I was, but frankly, it wasn't a big deal.
But you want, we go back to the trust question. You want Australians to trust you. Does this excessive secrecy help that?
No, I don't accept the assertion you're putting to me, Leigh. I mean, you're making accusations.
I just gave three examples.
Like the Labor Party does.
I gave you three concrete examples.
Yeah, these are minor matters, Leigh, that I don't think go to the issues you're talking about.
That's if
you want to join in on the accusations that the Labor leader makes in Parliament every day, well, you can join in.
I'm not interested in what the Labor leader's got to say. I'm putting to you three examples.
There's an uncanny resemblance between the allegations,
I'm putting to you three examples where there has been secrecy that I can't understand why you would have secrecy around. Say for example, Brian Houston. You've said this afternoon you invited him to the White House.
Let me deal with the issue of the Governance Committee, Leigh. The Governance Committee of Cabinet, which involves the Attorney General, the Prime Minister, the Deputy Prime Minister and the Deputy Leader of the Liberal Party, which is the Treasurer. That is a Governance Committee of Cabinet which deals with very sensitive information. It is not the practice of any government to release information that has been before the Governance Committee.
Why?
And so there's nothing extraordinary about that, Leigh. The Cabinet is a very serious committee of obviously the running of the government, and to suggest that somehow the Governance Committee of Cabinet should somehow be open slather, I don't think is a serious suggestion.
Well, what about the Brian Houston thing? Why did you keep that a secret?
Well, Leigh, at the time I was in the United States, we had had a very important meeting with the President of the United States. It was not a matter I was intending to be distracted by. And look, at the time, I could have answered the question differently. I've been upfront about that. But honestly, at the end of the day, it was not a significant matter. And people haven't asked me about it for months and months and months. A journalist asked me about it today and I just answered it straight up.
But the only reason I'm asking about it, because it is a minor matter, is because of the secrecy around it. I mean, there was an FOI request put in about it that came back and said that the information couldn't be disclosed because it would jeopardise Australia's relationship with the United States.
Well, the allegations that were being made at the time when I was in the United States went around possible leaks out of the President's office. Now, I wasn't about to get into the issues regarding what was said or wasn't said out of the President's office. As a guest in that country at the time, I didn't think that to be a very discreet way or diplomatic way to handle those questions.
Prime Minister, appreciate your time. Thank you for joining us this evening.
Thanks a lot, Leigh.
Hi, I'm Leigh Sales. Thanks for watching this story. If you'd like to watch more of 7:30's stories, they are on the left of your screen. And tap on the button below to subscribe and get the latest from ABC News.